Hi everyone, I'm Ekaansh. Thanks Digvijay for introducing sort of the topic. It's already a mouthful. Building a low-code React UI kit with JavaScript SDK. Hang in there, we'll talk about it in just a second. Um, that's a picture of my face from back when I had long hair and less back pain. But I'm a developer now. And yeah, I maintain sort of the React and React Native UI kits for Agora. And there's links to my GitHub and Twitter if you want to follow like bad humor on there. So let's talk about overview, right? So whenever like low code is all the rage, and if you're building something for developers, you want to reduce developer effort, right? And to convince the product team to do something, you need to like tell them metrics and how that's going to improve developer experience. You have to plan out sort of how the solution is going to look like, and you're going to have to, since we're talking about a specific JavaScript SDK, you're going to have to see how to make friends with JavaScript and React. And I'm also going to talk about some of the cool low-code things that we learned while building this out. So let's talk product challenges first. So we have a JavaScript SDK. If you use it in React, it seems really counterintuitive that it wouldn't work or it wouldn't work well because React uses JavaScript, but it has its own weight, it has its own pattern to do things. And sort of the right way to do things is React hooks. This might be really controversial, but that's what I feel. And then a lot of people learn React before JavaScript. I don't know why people do that, but it's a thing, and you have to account for it. So that's something we're going to discuss and how we can make it easier for them. It's difficult to get started quick because if you're using any SDK, there's sort of a learning curve where you're sort of doing the initialization, you're doing like the basic things to get started. And we thought we can do better. How about starting in 5 lines? And whenever you're doing something, you're reinventing the wheel each time. You're writing some UI, you're writing some SDK code, and a lot of that spans across projects, which is very similar. So I'm going to talk about that using reusable components. And from all my time on Twitter, like something that I've learned is that people hate CSS, just collectively shitting on CSS. Like everyone's a fan of Tailwind or whatever. But what if we just give you the UI out of the box and you don't have to write CSS, right? Pre-built UI. Oh, cool song. Awesome, thank you. So dev challenges. This is sort of where the product team sits together and you have developers putting their thinking caps on. So with JavaScript to React, I'm going to talk about it. You want to abstract away as much code as you can, so that includes both your SDK logic and your UI code. You want to make it easy to get started, so you have this sort of a high-level React component that you can plug in to an existing application. You want to allow people to customize the design features of your app, so we'll use React props for that. And you don't want to limit the user with low code. So this is something that I have a very personal pet peeve with. All low code solutions just assume that you're stupid and that you're going to make mistakes, so they limit you from doing things. And that sort of works to get started, but like it's sort of limiting where you'd have to sort of throw out the low code solution at some point and just dive back to the lower like low code layer. That's sort of the lower layer of how the SDK is built or whatever. Like that's sort of the paradigm shift we've seen with Rust, because people want speed, people want flexibility, and that's how we have like that coming up, becoming popular again. And we want to make low code a starting point for everything. Like that's sort of the goal we've set for ourselves. And maybe I'll go back a few slides and maybe we'll see why should you care, right? Like you're probably not building a low code solution today. Why is this talk sort of helpful to you? So 2 things. I'm going to talk about React patterns that we use to design a nice user-facing API that can be used internally within your teams, within your own React projects. That's sort of helpful to know. And we're also going to talk about if you had to build a low-code solution, what are the things that you should take care of? Cool. So just going to quickly show you this single line of code. That's sort of how the SDK works. You don't need to know anything about it, but it sort of instantiates an object using JavaScript. You can attach events, do things with that object that we've created. Now, the naive approach to use this in React would be just to do this in the function body, and things quickly go wrong. Each time your app re-renders, you're creating multiple instances of the same class or whatever, and you're attaching multiple events, just everything starts breaking. Anyone know how you would fix that? Yes, exactly. So you create a hook, and this is something we would expect users to do, but why not do this for them, right? So that's sort of the idea of how you would do this. We'll talk about that in just a second. But I want to emphasize that this just looks like a better API, right? Like this just looks like React. Does anyone agree, disagree? For me, I think hooks are wonderful. We should all use them. How do you create a custom hook for that sort of a scenario where you don't want to, use a useref and then use a use effect, do all of those things? It's really simple. How many of you know what a JavaScript closure is? Show of hands. Hey, awesome. So on line 3, we're sort of creating a closure. In case you don't know what a closure is, it's very simple. It's just a function with some data associated with it put together in a box, right? And you can talk about, it's something stored in the JavaScript heap and it's not part of the execution context and all of that. You should know it, but like for now, all we need to know is it's a function that has access to the data outside it. And as long as the function is in memory, it'll have the same reference to that same variable or same data. So we return this function from our hook. And whenever you call this function, it sort of checks if a client exists on line 4. If it doesn't, it creates a client. So that's your first hook call. And each subsequent hook gives you the reference to the same client essentially. So yeah, it just makes it really easy to use. This just works. And you can call this in any component down the tree and everything just is nice. Cool. Moving forward, this is what it looks like if you have an asynchronous sort of hook call. And it's possible, it's just beyond the scope of what we're discussing today. Everything's open source. You can find like links to everything on GitHub. And what I do want to talk about this is sort of this API. Does this look familiar to anyone in the audience? Like this sort of ready tracks error pattern of destructuring it from a hook? Yeah, so Apollo uses this for like the GraphQL client. And this sort of pattern is very common with a lot of libraries in React Native and React as well. And what we sort of thought is you shouldn't reinvent sort of how the API looks like for these things, because developers are used to doing things a particular way and we just are lazy to like learn new things. So if you can do something that already exists and sort of conform nicely to that well-known, well-tested API, things just work really smoothly. And we've sort of seen like a really good growth for this React wrapper we've built on top of this SDK. It's like a 100-line project. And we've already seen like 1,800 downloads and it's like growing real quick on NPM. So that's sort of nice feedback that, hey, people are using this, so it's probably like a right thing to talk about and share with other people. So let's talk low code. Before I tell you what a UI kit is, why would you even decide to go low code? Why would you want to get into building a UI kit? If this picture is sort of visible, you have like a bunch of lines behind my background. And it's sort of what we saw being repeated throughout multiple applications when people were building video calls. So I'm from Agora. We build real-time engagement SDKs, and that sort of works with like building video calls, live streams. So a lot of code is repeated. For example, if a user joins, you probably want to store this data in your state, and then whenever that data changes, you want to mutate your state, and you want to do things, and that's all sort of very React-specific things that people were reinventing sort of the wheel each time they were building a new app. So we thought we could do better, and that's what a full video call application looks like. Like those 3 lines, essentially, you plug them into your project, you have a video call going. It's really simple, and it's really nice to use. But I'm going to talk about what sort of things differentiate this from a sample app, right? So we thought that the very first thing is you want this to be flexible. You want the end user to customize the functionality without writing much code. So for example, if you were building a live streaming app, you add those 2 lines, you have a live streaming app. Props are wonderful. That's really how React components work. You want to change the layout, you pass another prop, and it works. So how many of you use Redux? Show of hands. How many of you use contexts? Awesome. So we have like a mixed bag. We chose to use context just for the simple reason that context is part of React, so you're not shipping extra code with Redux. And if someone knows React, you can expect them to learn, like other parts of React, like the context API. But you sort of don't want to limit them to like MobX or Redux or like a particular state management system that's not, is agnostic to sort of the framework that you're using. So all we do is we take all of those props that the user passes in, put them in a provider, and then wrap our entire component tree with that. So all of our application has access to the user's props, and then we can do like things based on what they're sort of giving us, right? So we have a way to customize the user experience using sort of the properties that they've passed to a component. Now, how do you get the data back from the UI kit, right? Like for example, if a user clicks a button, that's sort of part of the UI kit. That's not your component, but you sort of want a way for them to be able to do things when that happens. So whenever an event occurs, you sort of get a callback, and that's sort of how JavaScript works. So we sort of use the same idea to pass in this callback object. And when we have we're using TypeScript, so we have this list of keys that whenever this event occurs, you can pass in a custom function, and we execute it when it's required. So how does that look in code? Well, we check for events. We iterate over that events object using keys, and then we just bind those events to the client on method, and then we use the apply syntax to pass in all the arguments from the user back to the function using like an array. And yeah, it just gives you full flexibility in terms of, hey, I want to do something custom. I want to display a toast notification whenever someone's muting their mic. Well, you can do that. And this is my favorite bit, just because there's a cat on the screen, but also because it sort of lets you customize the UI without having to, plug and play different components. So you can, if you want to change the color of the end call button, you pass in this prop, you go to like wherever that object is nested, you change the border radius, you can do whatever you want. So we have UI kits for React Native, and on the left, you sort of see, it's your left, yes, it's your left. You can see sort of the out-of-the-box experience that you get, and on the right, you sort of see this thing that I made just by writing CSS. There's nothing else going, deeper into it. A quick gotcha of doing this is we're using prop spreading to sort of extract keys from this component. We have an empty object there just in case the user hasn't passed something. And then we sort of predetermine wherever these like properties go or the CSS styles go. And then one thing you should note, you can use the array syntax also, by the way. And one thing you need to keep in mind is that the user props should always go after the default props that you've passed in. This way you make sure that the user overrides what you've written. Make sense? Cool. So we talked about the high-level component. This is all we expect to, get better user adoption. Like if you want to see what the video looks like, what the quality is like, you don't have to spend an hour of your time building an application or testing out like sample apps. You just use your existing React app, plug these in, and you're good to go. But we still thought that, this isn't like flexible enough. What if I want to access the SDK within, my whole runtime? Like for example, I want to do something really specific. I want to use a custom background, and we can't iteratively, keep adding features and adding props. So we sort of want to give another way or another API for the user to do these things. And what's better than, just using React and React composition? So we sort of have these components being exported from our library, and this is where low code becomes like a part of like a full-fledged application where you get to have these pre-built plugins or pre-built components. I think Sanket talked about native base and how they sort of give you pre-built components. You can think of these like that, but with some sort of logic attached to them. And how we differentiate this is we differentiate the data from the UI. So all the UI components sort of expect to have access to the state, and that's managed by the context I talked about before. And you also have these data components which are just using React context that you can just wrap all of your things and they just play well together. And this is sort of what the high-level component internally looks like. And you can just use these to put it back together yourself. Why would you want to do that? Well, you can insert custom components into the tree wherever you want. And why is that important? It sort of looks tempting to do it this way on the right, where you can do this for really specific things where you know in advance that this is sort of what the user would want to do. This is where they'd want to insert a custom component. So you can think of, hey, there's probably an idea that they want to insert another button in the bottom bar. You can do this on the right, but it's sort of limiting because you can't tell what the user would want to do, right? Like they might want to just have a sidebar, or they want to have something part of the UI kit, accessing the UI kit data that's not something you've imagined before. So we sort of follow the right API using props for components, for replacing video placeholders when someone's muted. That's something that's a really quick example of what you can determine in advance. But on the left, we just give you full freedom to do whatever you want. And how that becomes really powerful really fast is that you can use the context to access the SDK that we talked about. So the JavaScript SDK that we build is still accessible, and you can do all sorts of like use effect things and like play with the state, mutate the state, and do all of those things. So you're getting full freedom to build your own applications starting from that low code point. And we sort of saw the events before they come back here. You can have different APIs for the same thing. And what I want to emphasize is that with low code, you're sort of taking decisions for the user in advance. You're giving them an experience out of the box, but you also don't want to limit them with the experience you've decided for them. You want to give them freedom to, not have to throw out your low code solution and go back to, using your SDK and just having to rewrite everything or like take inspiration from what you've written, but you want to empower them to do whatever they want. And that's sort of what we've learned and what we've done with both our React and React Native SDKs, sort of the UI kits we've built on top of them. And I sort of have like 3.5 minutes left. So I just want to talk about how web components are awesome. And there's this library called Diaflow that I want to shout out. It just packages your entire React runtime into like a nice JavaScript tag that is there on the top of the screen. And you see this HTML sort of component, that HTML attribute / tag. You pass in those attributes which look like React props, and you have a video call going in plain HTML without writing any code, because HTML is technically not a programming language. We can argue about that later. But yeah, so just want to show you how easy it is to build a Diaflow component. And we're sort of using this internally to package it for people using HTML, and we've seen like good feedback. It's very simple to how you would export a normal React application. You have your component, you have your callbacks. What's nice to see is that it sort of gives you this event context with the dispatch. And the way that works is that, so you sort of have this React paradigm where you have events, but you also have this HTML land, which is different, where events are different, and it's like JavaScript is the king there. So you use this event context to dispatch events back to HTML land, and it's very simple to do. You can just like use hooks. Hooks are wonderful, and you can pass in default props. It just is a nice, easy API. Even if you don't completely understand it, I hope it at least gives you an idea into like packaging your React applications into HTML for people who are not super familiar with coding or development, but are just starting out. It gives you a nice way to like adopt those users as well. So that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. If there's any questions, maybe we can like take few. But thanks for listening. Thanks for your time. That's me.